I know so many people who are down with like the massive plague right now. Yeah. Hey, Sil. Ellie, hi. Sil, yeah, I've turned on recording. I've got to figure out where they save it and how I can get at it and access and edit it. But hopefully I'll get that sorted and I can have it up on my website in a couple days. Technology with PowerPoint. Cindy, just get a 3D printer and print it out. Sil, hieroglyph? Oh, right. Oh, very good idea. Yeah, I was thinking about the ASU initiative with Michael, name, writer guy. Uh, Other writer guy at ASU, which I'm not there. But yeah, that writer guy. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to get started. Feel free to keep the back channel going. I'll keep an eye on it. So talk amongst yourselves, and I'll keep an eye open for questions. If you've got questions or want me to stop and amplify on something, let me know, because I know we got people here from like a wide range of backgrounds and knowledges of fandom and stuff like that. So keep the chat going. Okay, so thanks everybody for showing up, and especially for Syl for talking me into doing this, because this is fun and it's been a good project. So this is a version of a talk I've given a couple times now, once here at Lancaster University and once at the Cult Cinema and Technological Change Conference at Aberystwyth. And, oops, that is not the button to advance the slides. That's the button to advance the slides. Okay. This is part of what I'm looking at as a book project with a number of different case studies, all looking at how fan communities interact with each other and out to producers of the material that they're fans of. So I'm doing a whole bunch of conference presentations this summer on different bits of this. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll be in a position to start wrapping it up into an actual book project. Okay. Uh, so some of the reasons that I took this project on, some of the reasons why it was challenging is that I think fan studies is in a position where it's really starting to finally develop some tools for looking at how people are currently consuming, producing, and using media. And some of the problem behind that came from a lot of fan studies came from text-based work around zines to Usenet, and it was really focused on the written word. And I think it's only been in the past year or so that we're starting to see in academic journals some really good analyses of how people use a whole range of different media to construct and perform fandom. Um, we still don't have a lot of tools for looking at short form multimedia use, and Tumblr in particular is a really interesting platform because it does things very differently in some ways from how social media that fans have used in various generations of media in the past. So we're just now starting to see in print the first few studies of people actually looking at Tumblr as fandom practice. And there's the challenge from if your subject is fannish practice, on the one hand, saying something really meaningful about a platform like Tumblr, and on the other, tracking that practice as it goes from Tumblr to blogs to IM to Facebook to Twitter back around again, and how conversations happen across those or branch off onto different ones, and getting a picture of the whole media landscape around even a particular very small fannish conversation is a real challenge. So in looking at how people have done fan studies in the past and even up till now, it seems like there are two different models that academics use when looking at fans, or they look at two different kinds of things. And I've called those the membrane and the borderlands. And a lot of fan studies looks at fandom within the membrane, so within its own little community, how fans talk to each other, interact with each other, create meaning for each other, create products for each other, like fan fiction or cosplay. And then there's another kind of fan studies that looks at fandom across the borderland, so across the sort of negotiated and sort of open space between fans and producers. So things like show renewal campaigns, um, consumption of traditional Hollywood star media, things like that. But I'm trying to make an argument for how entangled both of those things have gotten and the need to, without whatever your question is in fandom, look at both the membrane of how fans talk to each other and the borderlands of how fans react, not just to producers, but to mainstream media, to society as a whole, to their daily lives. So what I'm doing with this case is looking at, I've got a couple questions within the membrane and a couple questions across the borderlands to see how that whole landscape fits together. So fan studies, is usually about making stuff, either making a thing or making a community. And I'm switching back and forth here between my notes in the Mac PowerPoint version and the one that's being shared. So I'm kind of umming as I go back to looking back and forth. So there's two metaphors generally in sort of membrane and fan studies. And the big one that a lot of people know is Henry Jenkins, who started talking about this a long time ago in terms of poaching, or of fans sort of illicitly taking content from the people who really truly own it and using it for their own ends. There's another notion which I think is a lot more useful, particularly in this context, which comes from the Russian philosopher Bakhtin, who talks about dialogism, or basically a conversation, and saying that every media product is part of a conversation with others and with society. Media studies is also tend media studies, particularly as I'm finding in the UK, as I'm getting a sense of the history of what this field was like over here compared to the US, seems to have grown particularly out of the study of broadcast TV, with a sort of critical, often Marxist model of you know, capital and labor, producers and consumers, and a second generation that looked at reception, or how people took the product that was being pushed at them by the owners of the means of creative production. And I think both those models have some real limitations. Ali, I am making my way through all the boxing, and there's going to be a ton of it in the final paper that comes out of this thing. Okay, so on the Borderlands side, one of the things that particularly interests me is that we're seeing now a generation of people who are making stuff in Hollywood and Hollywood equivalents who grew up as fans and who come from a shared culture of fandom that their audiences have. And I think that's really transforming the media landscape. And so those kind of fall out into three different kinds of things. Problematic ones where there's open conflict between producers and fans. Celebratory exchanges where everybody just kind of gets together and squeeze. And transmedia exchanges where fandom moves across platforms, across objects, out of just the fanish conversation and into the wider world for things like charity work. Problematic, Moffat is a jerk. Yes! And jerk producers are something that absolutely fascinates me, which is also why I'm studying DC Comics, which is probably the world's greatest example of jerk producers. Yes. Okay. So I've got two questions here, one from each side of this perspective on fandom. So to translate out of jargon, the question I have across the borderlands looks at what's real, what's canon, what counts as meaning, what counts as being sort of approved real content when you have fans and producers talking to each other, and how those gaps are filled between the story that appears on the screen, the stories that fans want, and the stories that fans and producers want to tell to themselves or tell to their friends. On the membrane side, I'm particularly interested in how feminist discourse is created and shared within fandom. So how people who might come to fandom new find themselves in a really pretty sophisticated world of concepts around feminism and media production and media content, how they get introduced into that dialogue, how they share it, how they talk about it, and then how they pass it on to people who come into fandom a little bit later and a little bit later, and also how people argue over what things mean within feminist fandom. Beth, canon and Star Wars, yes, yes, that's something I'm really following. It's huge, and I really have to wonder whether I don't know that we need it. I've never really understood it, but it seems to appeal to something really deep in us. That's sort of a need for an authoritative narrative, and I think that's something that really is worth exploring. Okay, giving the text chat a minute to get caught up. Yeah, Allie, good example. Sarah Shepard writing the non-canon version of her own books. And still saying, I don't know how much of all this is going to get recorded, so I'm repeating some of the comments. It's like the formalization of RP with something like Storium. Yeah, yeah, that's another interesting thing to follow is co-creation of narrative that gets shared and you can invite people in openly. Of course, that's stuff that, you've been doing for a really long time. Okay, so introduce what I'm talking about in this case and what all the pieces are. So we've got Pacific Rim, which was released last summer. Everybody here knows it. Kind of a cult movie in the sense of the term that it wasn't as much of a mainstream success as expected, but it developed a really, really super passionate fan base really quickly. Also looking at Tumblr very specifically as a source of fan discourse. And one of the things I find interesting about Tumblr is that unlike LiveJournal and a lot of its predecessors, which were very text-based, um, Tumblr makes it very easy to create images, to share images, to talk about images. So it reintroduces the visual into fandom of visual media, which seems kind of important. And here's a case where there's really a lot of positive interaction between fans and creators, both the writers and producers of Pacific Rim, and a character where that came as close to not existing at all as humanly possible. And so, kind of the perfect example of a blank slate to read meaning onto. So why Pacific Rim? Lots of fan creator interaction. Um, the writer and producer were both really accessible to fans, engaging with them across a lot of different media, understand fandom from inside and outside, and have a long history of dealing constructively with fans. Still, really good point on how well Pacific Rim did outside. I have to wonder how much of that is, the kind of poor job that the U.S. marketing campaign did versus the long tradition of U.S. action movies with some depth to them selling internationally because there's lots of explosions. It's really easy to translate explosions in action. Um, Versus also how much of sort of the subversive message of this movie picked up better in other markets than the U.S. And I think those are questions that really could be worth looking at. Also, one of the exciting things about this movie is it was in the genre of a very traditional Hollywood action movie, but it took almost all of those Hollywood tropes and turned them on their heads. So you see a very strong female character. You see, particularly the core message of the movie is that the action can't be performed by the typical Hollywood lone action hero, but it has to be done together with somebody else. And that message of cooperation is extraordinarily rare and kind of subversive within Hollywood, I think. Also, you see scientists portrayed a little bit for comic value, but also as sort of the core plot drivers of the movie, the people who are really moving the story forward and contributing in a substantial way to the overall plot in a way that you don't often see in sci-fi action movies. And of course, with the two scientists, you had something that fandom was going to pick up on and ship really readily. They were kind of the perfect characters for slash fanfic. Still got to ship the white dudes. There, yep, yep. And that's kind of the theme of this piece, or at least that was the notion that I had in mind when I came to it. because the original title of this stuff was Erasing Vanessa, because I had thought that the story that we're going to see in a couple minutes would get just completely drowned out by the desire of fandom to see a white male pairing within fannish discourse. So okay, so you've got the slash of the two scientist characters being really popular within fandom, and a lot of fan stuff being produced. But and and there's nothing in the movie itself to code either of them as not either not straight, not gay, taken by other people, however you want to read it. So the field was kind of wide open to slash interpretation, except for one really super small thing. Allie, one of them is differently abled physically. That is definitely going to come up in a minute. Um, one catch was in the movie novelization and also in the coffee table book, which I'm looking at over here, Pacific Rim, Man, Machines, and Monsters. There was one sentence. And in the personnel dossier, so nowhere in the actual narrative, even of the novelization, but in these little character sketches of all the characters, you see here for Herman, the scientist, in very small print, married to Vanessa. So it's established in this secondary medium that Herman is married. So what? A couple questions come up here. First one is, does fandom privilege a slash reading? So is fandom going to go first to a slash reading, say, this is what we want to see, and kind of willfully or otherwise disregard anything that might interfere with the appreciation of the slash pairing? What counts as canon? This Married to Vanessa was in the novelization, the coffee table book, not in the movie. So does that even matter? And if it does or doesn't, how does canon and fanon, or what fans would like to see or believe is true, how do they interact? How do they talk to each other? How do they negotiate around each other? Fandom still says fandom always goes to the slash reading. Heck, Pepper gets erased, and she's literally the hero of I Am Free. Oh, that is a huge point, and another terrific paper topic, which I hope somebody else writes instead of me, because yeah, how Pepper gets erased from the extensive adventures in I Am fanfic canon is really astonishing, and definitely something that bears discussion. Okay, so for the next section here, I'm reproducing some posts from Tumblr and where it's available a little bit of how the authors of the post describe themselves. Still also says, so does Rhodey. Very good point. Okay, so one fan is saying Vanessa was introduced in the novelization. Generally, I don't count that as canon. But I would normally completely ignore the Pacific Rim novelization work, not for Travis Beacham, the author's repeated mentions of Vanessa on Tumblr. So it's clear she's a character he'd very much like to see brought into the movieverse canon. So this person is saying, ordinarily novelizations don't count for me as to what's real, what's canon. But since the author has said in secondary media that he really likes this character, well, then that influences my thoughts about what counts as canon and what doesn't. And here's where Travis Beacham talks about the character of Vanessa. I'm going over to my other set of slides where it's a little more readable. And at first, when somebody asks him about Vanessa, he just says, Vanessa's Herman's wife, she's English, and she's a model. And then again, a couple days later, he follows up with this description. Mixed race, nice glasses, long, tightly curled black hair that tends to flare a little wispily, very tall. A sum of features that may at one point in her life have been a bit awkward for her, but her effortless confidence has since made something quite striking of it all. She's a presence. So you get the sense from that Travis Beacham really likes Vanessa and has a picture of her in his mind, that this is not just a throwaway couple words in some secondary medium. And this gets picked up on Tumblr, obviously, and people respond to it really passionately and really emotively. And I've just been reading a couple of good articles on Tumblr and what's being called polymedia usage, or how people use a whole different range of media products and social networking products to communicate, and how important to both Tumblr specifically and to polymedia generally emotion and identification are. So this description of Vanessa as mixed race really strikes a profound code with people who are struck by or displeased with the whitewashing of fandom. And so you see something like, going over to my other set of slides so I can read it, uh, Travis Beacham is a good man who actually cares. He actually fucking cares. For me as a queer woman who loves sci-fi, I feel like I finally have someone in Hollywood who is on the side of people who aren't cis white men. So really profound identification and passion towards this fan, fan producer co-creation of Vanessa. Richard says, now that's interesting. Author's genuine care for a character convinces us of his canonicity, of her canonicity. Yeah, yeah, very interesting point. Okay, now here's the other side of this. Vern Gorman, the actor who played Herman, was interviewed at a con. I've not been able to track down the actual interview online anywhere. Um, oh, another good point. It says white men equals no projection of femininity. Um, so Vern Gorman's asked about the slash pairing, and he says, I really like it. I can see it there. It's something that I approve of and kind of agree with. And this then starts an explosion in fandom between the people who really like the slash pairing and are thrilled to see an actor for once coming out and saying, yeah, I think that's an okay and actually cool thing that I can see between the characters, and the people who are starting to feel this passionate attachment to uh, the character's mixed race spouse. So we had a brief but really pretty intense shipping war over these two perspectives. The one actually, really enjoying this almost canon-like from the actor buy-in to a queer disabled male pairing on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who are really buying into the author's support for a pairing with a woman of color. And of course, the author's also mentioned that Vanessa is a model. So you get some real explosion around that notion, both for and against. And this is the kind of thing I mean by contesting through dialogue what it is that it means to be a feminist fan. And you see this one woman really coming down on the notion of the author portraying a disabled scientist's spouse as a model, and thinks that it means superficiality, body consciousness, and a number of things that she associates with being a model. Also, problematizing what it means to be a model. Exactly. So a comment, a very broad societal comment tagged to the sentence of description from the author. Or scientists is just being disinterested in anything but science. Yep. So that gets some critical response. Yeah. Disgusting, misogynistic asshole for everything you said about models. And I'm so glad we're discussing Vanessa Gottlieb's right to exist as a character entirely in terms of Herman. So again, feminist discourse, feminist modes of looking at controversial texts, and and again, this association with Vanessa and support of her, and talking about her right to exist as a character based on 5 words of text in the novelization again. And I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying that it shows how passionately attached to identity and very particular heartfelt identities of fans. The characters from Pacific Rim, even ones like Vanessa, who's just a couple sentences, had become. Also, assumptions about what a disabled person would be interested in. Yeah. Okay. And here's one that was one of the things that I really would like to get at in my fandom research. Um, I'm so sick and tired of this shit. In every fandom, I have to see this bullshit woman hatred. I've argued so many times for amazing female characters like Jane Foster, Shannon Rutherford, Toriel, etc., and I will continue to argue for every damn female character, no matter how minor they are, who gets degraded by misogynist ass bags. Now, what's interesting about this is that the critique isn't coming from dude bros. It's not coming from the growing virulent male misogyny within fandom. It's coming from women within fandom. And I think that the author of this post point really stands is that you could say that there really is quite a bit of erasure of female characters to the point of misogyny by women in fandom. And I really don't know what that's about or how to research it or how to theorize it. That's one of the things I'm struggling with here. And some more piling on. Protect Vanessa Gottlieb at all costs, and where the title of this paper comes from, which I just love, the Vanessa Gottlieb Defense Brigade. We're on a quest to defend this most wonderful woman, who is 3 lines of non-canon text, when she was born, who now is something very, very much more than that, against despicable haters. Ali saying, in general, fannish shipping persists in and survives on competing fixed characterizations. Finally, after a couple of weeks of this, somebody makes the point that even accepting as canon that Herman is married to Vanessa, that doesn't say anything dispositive about the sexualities, the orientations, or the practices of any of the people involved. That there are bisexuals, there are polyamorous people, there are open marriages, and that this oppositional reading really isn't based in necessarily in people's lives. And that's another thing that I find fascinating about this, and I'm trying to get at studying and kind of struggling with, is while it seems like within fandom and fandom on Tumblr in particular, women's bisexuality in fans is commonplace, kind of norm, accepted. Women's bisexuality in fan construction, in fanfic, in fan imaginations is kind of erased. And that was my original notion behind the title Erasing Vanessa, was that Vanessa, for fans, could not be read as somebody bisexual, polyamorous, open, nor could Herman, which turned out not in practice to be the case. But this is, this person's statement is coming late to the discussion and making a point that was not one of the first points made in the conceptualizations of Vanessa. Still says it's really a divide between two factions in the same fandom. The slashers who often fancy themselves pro-gay, minority feminists who are always ready to show up for women. Yep. And again, dear Herman shippers who are angry about Herman having a wife, polyamory is a thing, bisexuals are a thing. And finally, of course, as happens in shipping wars, somebody steps in to play peacemaker to argue both sides of the case. And I think this really sums up nicely the identity politics of Vanessa on both sides, which is the point that Sill's getting to. That a lot of the critique was awful and misplaced for essentializing what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a model, what it means to have any particular orientations. And on the other hand, how important it was for people to see race, gender, orientation that they identified with explored and legitimized by the actors and writers of the object of their fandom. Point being, Alice's point being, it may be more about fan reader interpretation of a particular character they're defending than anything about the other they're being shipped with. That's an interesting point, and and something that I need to consider because I had been looking at this through the lenses of identity politics rather than through textuality or identification with the primary on-screen characters. And I might be missing something there. And I'm ending the segment with some images from the artist who I used on the slide cover. There's a lot of fan art. And this woman's was my particular favorite. I just really like it. So I wanted to come back around to that again. But to end off by this tag on her post where she's giving credits to people who like her art. Says, it's for anyone who sees this. Thank you so much for everyone for all the love. I'm really glad you like it, Arg, especially you, Mr. Beecham. So the author who created Vanessa had reblogged her artwork um, without comment, but sort of giving an implicit thumbs up to the artist for this image of Vanessa as a disabled model, as a prosthetics model. So here we see how complicated this whole world of fandom and canonicity and fan production is, and how it really, at this point, any sort of traditional media studies notions of producers and consumers really have to get thrown out the window, because you have the product that appeared on the screen from a Hollywood studio. You've got what the writer added to a novelization. You've got fan production being vetted by the writer, brought back around again, and fans and producers in real time co-creating sort of something like canon together and sharing and fleshing out this universe that we only got to see 2 hours of on the screen. Okay, stopping to get caught up on the comments. Someone we know being attacked for destroying fandom by editing Dean Winchester as a beta and Sam as alpha. Yeah. Fanon and headcanons are explicitly not canon. Most shippers know their pairing is not going to be canon. Many don't care. Yeah. Um, what's interesting about this case is you've got that reaching across the divide from actor and writer and saying, I like this particular fandom. And so you've got, what I'm calling here a borderlands of the zone of sort of sometimes licit, sometimes illicit, sometimes gray traffic back and forth between these two camps. It's creating something that really isn't one or the other. I mean, it's not canon, but it's not canon. And I find that fascinating. I really want to see what starts to develop in spaces like that. Doesn't that really jump back to the earlier comments of who needs canon anymore? I'm interested in that because, going back to the Star Wars case that Beth brought up, what does it matter that Disney said that the expanded universe isn't canon? You can still buy the books, you can still read the books, you can still enjoy the books. So, what difference does it make? On the other hand, saying that things and characters that you like, and particularly that the expanded universe enabled a lot more strong and interesting women characters that are now decanonized. Is that a slam on those characters and thus also on representation of strong women in media? So saying the stories are still there, well, yeah, they are. And from my perspective, I can enjoy them just as much. There's definitely something to be said on the other side that sort of official blessing really counts for something if you're talking about identities that don't get official blessing a lot of the time, like people of color, like gay, lesbian, and bi identities. And that may still matter. New media is this, whoa, 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 okay, slowing back. Um, Fan service, yeah, fan service is a really interesting point, and particularly when fan service, like in the Supernatural case, can arguably be tied to trolling in a way on the part of the producers. You get some really interesting dynamics going. Richard, if new media is this dialogic form as opposed to print culture, is it more about our collective interpretation? Yeah, I really think it is. And On the one hand, I'm fascinated by why a lot of fans still really passionately care about canon as a concept. And on the other, particularly as fans become producers, and even with properties that have been around as long as say Star Trek and Star Wars have, we've got fans of that property becoming producers of that property. It seems like all sort of an open borderlands of traffic going back and forth rather than a membrane or fence or wall between canon official producers, Hollywood gets a paycheck, and consuming stay-at-home fans. And canon both ownership and a means of saying their fan work is better and more authentic. Yeah, yeah. Um, there's an anthology that just came out recently by Ann Jameson called "Whoa, this backwards stuff is confusing fic," which is freaking incredible. And it's got a long section on Twilight fandom, which I didn't even think I was going to read at first and wasn't particularly interested in. But it is absolutely amazing on different concepts of what fan production is and how it relates to canon and how fan communities can or can't be kept behind a membrane that keeps them separate from the production community, the cash economy. Ooh, yeah. In some ways, it's not like the debate over self-publishing versus traditional publishing. Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the arguments that one of the authors in the Thick anthology makes about Twilight is that Twilight fandom, they say, has had absolutely no connection with the very, very long history of media fandom or the even longer history of fandom generally, and that it reinvented the fandom wheel entirely. And in doing so, did not share a lot of the sort of fannish DNA that all the rest of fandom did, particularly with regards to notions of the fan community as something behind a membrane, something separate from the production economy that worked on a gift economy basis of sharing an attribution versus taking out, walling off, copywriting, and selling. And so when certain works of fan fiction got repurposed as print books with their fan origins obscured, and particularly with fan labor as beta readers being uncredited, um, those Twilight fans who came from the history of fandom saw that as a breach of that membrane. Whereas on the other side, the people who had no concept of those social norms just saw it as, it's all kind of an open borderland, so we can go back and forth at will. Self-publishing versus traditional public argument is a favorite of mine, especially when it comes to something like YouTube reauthoring the video game narratives and all that ilk. Yeah, yeah, it gets really complicated. Uh, so summing up here, my initial hypothesis was that Vanessa was going to get erased, that she was just going to get kind of steamrollered by fan production and fan views around the tradi- traditional within fandom male-male shift. Didn't happen. And what we got was a really critical, informed, and thoughtful debate over identity and intersectionality, of how fans conceive their own identities and the identities of characters in canon and fanon, and found means of interaction and of supporting or at least tolerating a varied range of positions there. Why did it happen? Fandom is critical. Fandom is all about not just squee, but engaging critically with texts that don't, the fanish impulse comes from there's something there that you didn't get, that you want more of, that you want to explore. So fandom, from its roots, has been looking at canon text with a critical eye, and then looking at each other's text with a critical eye through beta reading, through discussion, and through the practice of the gift economy. And the Tumblr as a medium is really particularly good for that. There's an article that just came out in New Media and Society that I was just reading earlier today, um, it's a really sharp analysis of how Tumblr does that in a way that's different from a lot of other platforms. And some of it comes from hashtagging, and some of it comes from comments not being open the way they are in a lot of other blogger forums. So you don't get the rapid descent into, you know, just pure greater internet fuckwad theory that you see on a lot of other platforms, and that there is a more moderated interaction across a borderlands rather than just a piling on of commentary. Still agreed, white women wouldn't have garnered the immediate feminist POC defense. She'd been just another fridgeable white chick. Very, very good point. And how does this happen? Fandom's co-producing with fans and official producers and across a very broad media landscape, across a broad range of platforms, and across this now kind of open borderlands of professional versus amateur production. Yes, but only because it's Tumblr and there's an inverse reaction there to usual privilege. Super, super good point, Sil. And that's something that I'm exploring in the academic paper version of this, is how fandom as a space has gotten marked by feminist discourse and slash, such that that's the starting point. And that's the sort of dominant discourse that one engages with there. And how something like a reading of a character is married has to come at it as what some authors call a subaltern reading, or something that isn't the privileged reading in the space. And so there's something in inversion that gets, in this case, gets inverted again by Vanessa being described as a person of color. You've seen this situation with Metro 2033 and the author going to fan authors of the queer. No, Richard, I want to talk to you offline about that, because I've got those on my to-read list as something I really, really want to get to, and I don't know anything about their context. There's a lot more noise and fear of invoking the noise with POCs. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's still a very fraught space for discourse. And I think one of the reasons why it worked in this case is that it's so hard to talk to people on Tumblr that you don't get that while there was a shipping war, it was not a flame war, because it's people speaking in their own spaces and only very occasionally reblogging with their own commentary. So you get an exchange, and this article I was reading earlier today had a quote from the creator of Tumblr saying that they really hate open discourse on the internet and created the technology of Tumblr to kind of draw the venom out of it in advance through software and hardware infrastructure, which I think is really fascinating. I think it's why this case worked the way it did. So what does all this mean? I think we're seeing a lot more of the borderlands of this, of a more open interaction between differently situated fans, actors, writers, producers. But on the other hand, there still is a membrane around fandom such that the discourse around fandom that holds as normalized, white male slash, is very different from the sorts of conversations you'd see in mainstream media or out in the street around a big Hollywood movie. Questions of ownership and intellectual property get really, really super vague here. Not just from a legal perspective, but two, from this spread of the gift economy over territory that used to be the cash economy, but now it isn't so clear anymore. And again, coming back to concepts of Bakhtin and dialogism, which I'm just exploring as being a much better model than Henry Jenkins' poaching, for talking about what's happening across that interface between people who are paid to create in this space and people who are not paid to create in this space. People are much more scared of being labeled racist and misogynistic, possibly because so much of fandom is nominally white women. They claim lack of prejudice just by raising hand. Yep. So some questions that didn't get answered here that I'm hoping to explore, as I turn this into a full paper and as I put together some other case studies in areas around this, like DC Comics fandom. One of the methodological problems was that it was really hard to find the criticisms of Vanessa and the attacks on her because of the way hashtags work on Tumblr. So I could look at the Vanessa Gottlieb hashtag and find all the pro-Vanessa stuff. but there's a social norm of not going into other people's hashtags to harsh on them. So finding the anti-Vanessa stuff was near impossible because it mostly took place in the Herman Newt shipping tag, which was such a vast amount of material in which a tenth or a hundredth of 1% addressed Vanessa in any way whatsoever. So very tiny needle and very tiny and very, very large haystack on the one side, and on the other side, a tightly bounded amount of material. So methodologically, the hashtag has problems for identifying what's going on in a conversation, a small conversation about a much larger topic. Um, from a research methods ethics, I treated the material in this conversation as being open and public, since it was in open public tumblers. There's a very strong trend in ethics of internet research against treating material like that as public and towards obscuring authorship, obscuring direct quotes, not sourcing material, not providing URLs to specific sites. And I've chosen to do it based on how this platform works. Very, very controversial choice, which I'm acknowledging here. The question I mentioned earlier of why female bisexuality is common in fans, but not so common in fan production, don't know. And the open question from looking at a movie fandom as opposed to a TV fandom where you've got years and hundreds of episodes of interaction to look at, one property, one very, very tiny set of canon. If there is future production Pacific Rim canon, are we going to see Vanessa, and are we going to see one of these iterations of Vanessa again? Why do women hate the vag? A question for the ages. I may have to steal that as a paper topic at some point. That is pretty awesome. Michael Camille, Image on the Edge, Image of Marginalia as far fanfic Marginalia for canon. Yeah, Ali, thank you for Camille. I've found him really helpful. I think that's a great concept to be building on. So core questions on feminist acculturation have gone unanswered. I think the reasons for that are Tumblr may be the wrong platform. I don't think a lot of people are coming to Tumblr brand new to fandom. Um, I suspect that there are other places where the "hi, I'm totally new" discourse happens, and that by the time people come to Tumblr, they've had years of acculturation into fandom and are participating at a much, much higher level than in places like fanfiction.net, which might be geared more towards people who don't have that long history. Wrong fandom. I don't think Pacific Rim was anybody's first fandom. So looking at a property that does draw people who are new, like Harry Potter did for a generation of new young fans, where wonderful example that is pointed out in the Thick anthology of Twilight, where people came to Twilight without any prior exposure to fanishness of other things. Um, Also, possibly the wrong method. That while I think it's really important to stick very close to particularities of technology, what they can and can't do, what they permit and what they constrain, that because I think fandom is, as this fairly new article has described it, polymedia, that it is inherently across platforms and using platforms simultaneously in different ways. Saying I'm going to look at one tiny slice of this great big world of conversation may be fundamentally misguided, which raises problems of how do you study a polymedia fandom or polymedia fan conversation. And I don't know that we've got answers for that yet. Um, that's what I've got. So thanks for listening. I'm going to stick around, so if anybody wants to continue the chat, I'll be here. If not, don't feel obligated. Thanks a lot for coming. I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to do this. So officially, I'm going to stop recording now, but chat can continue. So thanks, and